Okay, so here we have the next part of Innovate Stage 4. We're going to look at baking. It's a science. It's final part actually as the Chalford Guides are doing, but other groups will be doing this in any old order. We set everybody in a Zoom meeting. We split them up into two different rooms. We're giving everyone a bit of an overview of what the different products that we were going to use in our baking did. And then we set everyone the opportunity to work out how they would improve the recipe, knowing what they knew about the type of ingredients we had on offer and what they would add to the recipe as well. And as a result, we've ended up with two separate recipes that we're going to test out. So this is the next part of Baking It's a Science, which is part of Innovate Stage 4 Skills Builder that we've been working on in First Chalford Guides. For a change, you can actually see me, but that's only really so I can introduce you to what we're doing and to demonstrate that I'm following the current guidance with regards to working indoors. Stylish, isn't it? Righto, so we are going to make the cakes, biscuits, cookies, the recipes that you wrote last week in guides. They look like this. So here are the ingredients for recipe A. 175 grams flour, 125 grams sugar, 100 grams butter, 2 eggs, half a teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons baking powder, tablespoon of sprinkles, props to that group for originally suggesting exactly 79, and a tablespoon of cocoa powder. The only baking instructions I've received from this group is that the sprinkles have to be within the mixture. So I'm going to follow this fairly standard baking practice of cream the butter and the sugar, add the eggs, add the flour, add the bicarb and the cocoa, and just go with it from there. So this is going to be done at the Scout and Guide headquarters this week. You can see I've got trays, baking powder, butter, sprinkles, golden syrup, eggs, flour, sugar, cocoa powder. I've got cutters and a rolling pin in case we end up with something that comes out like a dough, and baking parchment just in case it sticks. Now we've got the butter and sugar nicely creamed together, and we've added in the eggs, which have so far mixed mechanically, and it's worked pretty well, so we'll carry on with that. Next up, we start to fold in the flour, salt and baking powder, and we're going to do this by hand. I don't know if you can see, but where the egg has slightly started to curdle in the sugar and the butter, you mix in the flour, and that helps stop that from happening. At this point, the raising agent, which is the baking powder, has begun to start working, so you have to work relatively quickly now. So this is what it looks like with the rest of the flour beginning to dry up nicely, and the cocoa powder in. And before we get too firm a dough, I'm now going to add in your tablespoon of sprinkles, and we'll give them all the mix in, and I'll show you what that looks like next. So having combined everything together, we've ended up with a mixture that isn't very doughy, but is quite cakey. And as a result, I am going to transfer it onto this baking sheet, onto baking paper that I've greased, and put it out in dollops, and it will sort of make cakelets, I think. Here we have the little heaps of dough from recipe A. You can see they've already got quite frothy and fluffy, which shows where the baking powder has begun to work with the egg and the sugar and the butter. And the gluten mix that's holding it all together nicely. Don't forget this is Baking It's a Science. I'm going to put them in the oven, and largely I'm going to cook them till they're done, and I'll let you know how long that takes when I've done it. This is what recipe A looked like after about 10 minutes in the oven. It's sort of all merged together, so that's quite exciting. And the best way to test if a cake's done is to stab it and see if your knife comes away clean, which I think this one does. So these are fluffily sorted. I'm going to have to cut them up in order to fit them in the bags ready to send out to you all at Guides. And in the meantime, I better get on with the washing. So here we are with recipe B, which is 100 grams butter, 100 grams sugar, 150 grams flour, 1 egg, half a teaspoon of baking powder, sprinkles, and 2 tablespoons of golden syrup. They only said sprinkles, so I think we'll add some sprinkles and we'll see how we look and go from there. Just like with recipe A, I'm going to combine these in a traditional cake mixing way, so creaming the butter and sugar, adding the egg, the baking powder, the flour, syrup and sprinkles. So this is what the butter and sugar look like when creamed together, remarkably similar to A, although they were in exactly the same proportion. At this point we're going to add the egg, as you can see, and we're going to add the syrup, and then we're going to add the flour, and then we will discuss the sprinkles. Right, here we have everything mixed together, the flour, the eggs, the butter, the sugar, the the baking powder and the syrup, and we're going to ponder how many sprinkles we add. Do we add just a few? Add a few more, sort of stir of a few. Well, you can't really see there's a few more, so I'm going to channel my inner guide and add a lot more. Even then, would you really believe I'd put a lot more in? Oh, I've got sprinkles. Feeling slightly silly. Nobody's given me any instructions. In they all go. Now, sprinkles notwithstanding, you can see that this is a thicker mixture than recipe A, which is very light and fluffy. Can you get close enough to that? Yeah, there you go. You can't really see any air bubbles beginning to pop up, but I think I'm still going to need to grease a baking sheet and put dollops of it on there next. Righto, here are 12 or so of recipe B with all of their sprinkles settled down and set out in their pan ready to go in their little quills. They're not rising with the same super rapidiness, but they look quite a good structure. There's a few little bubbles starting to appear, so let's put them in the oven. With the results of baking batch B. Ooh, they're very fluffy, but they've flattened out very nicely, and I don't think they're actually quite done yet if you look where I cut into them. Whereas these guys were nice and sort of dry and soft and fluffy. These guys are still have a bit of sticky in their midst, so I think we'll put them in for a little bit longer, but we might turn the oven down so they don't burn because they are just beginning to go brown. So here is the final look at recipe B. It's been cooked for a little bit longer and it's come up this rather lovely golden brown. Now that is probably because of the golden syrup. It's probably going to be quite hard to separate individual cookies, which I'll give a shot in a moment, just so you can see what A looks like now it's ready to go in its envelopes, looking actually really quite good.